A crowned child watches power kill his family. From that wound grows a ruler who will drown Russia in blood, remake the state through terror, and prove that fear can be stronger than love, and last far longer. Ivan Vasilievich was 3 years old when his father died, and in that moment Russia learned what happens when a crown rests on a child's skull. His father was Grand Prince Vasily III of Moscow, ruler of a brutal but rising state, feared by rivals and obeyed by nobles who understood that survival meant loyalty. When Vasily died in December of 1533, the crown passed to his son, Ivan IV, a boy, a symbol, a prize. The real power fell immediately into the hands of others. Ivan's mother, Elena Glinskaya, became regent. She was intelligent, politically sharp, and dangerously effective. She moved fast, centralizing authority, cutting down rival princes, reforming the currency, and fortifying Moscow. For a brief moment, Russia was ruled by a woman who understood that hesitation invited death. But Elena had enemies, and enemies in Moscow did not wait. In 1538, when Ivan was 8, his mother died suddenly. The official cause was illness. The truth was poison. Everyone knew it. No one said it aloud. The boy who wore the crown watched as the only shield he had was removed, and the men who had waited patiently stepped out of the shadows. They were the Boyars, the ancient noble families of Russia, most notably the Shviskys and the Belskys. They did not see a child to protect. They saw a throne to be devoured. What followed was not a regency. It was a feeding frenzy. Ivan grew up inside the Kremlin, surrounded by gold, icons, incense, and contempt. The Boyars fought openly in front of him, insulted him, ignored him, sometimes beat him. They starved him of attention and affection while gorging themselves on power. He watched servants be dragged away and disappear. He watched allies fall and rivals rise overnight. He learned early that in Russia, law was a costume, and violence was the body underneath. There are stories from this period that never left him, of Boyars bursting into his chambers drunk, mocking him while he clutched his royal robes, of Ivan and his younger brother Yuri left unfed while nobles feasted, of animals tortured for amusement. Whether every detail is true matters less than what the child absorbed: humiliation, helplessness, and rage with nowhere to go. This is where the monster began, not with madness, but with memory. Ivan learned to read early. He read obsessively, scripture, chronicles, tales of conquest and divine punishment. He learned the language of God and the language of power at the same time, and in his mind, they fused. Kings were chosen, enemies were sinful, suffering was proof of righteousness. He did not dream of love, he dreamed of control. At 13, the balance shifted. In December of 1543, Ivan summoned the Boyars. They came expecting another empty ceremony, another chance to posture around the child prince. Instead, Ivan pointed at one of the most powerful men in Russia, Prince Andrei Shvisky. Without raising his voice, Ivan accused him of corruption and abuse. Then he gave an order. The guards seized Shvisky and dragged him outside. According to multiple accounts, the prince was thrown to the palace dogs and torn apart. Whether this detail is literal or symbolic, the message was unmistakable. The boy was finished being prey. Ivan had learned the most important lesson of his childhood: cruelty works. When he was 16, Ivan did something unprecedented. He did not merely become Grand Prince of Moscow. In January of 1547, he crowned himself Tsar of all Russia, a title derived from Caesar, loaded with imperial weight. This was not vanity. It was a declaration of absolute authority. Ivan was no longer first among nobles. He was above them, God's ruler on earth. Moscow burned that same year. A catastrophic fire tore through the city, killing thousands. The people panicked. Rumors spread that Ivan's relatives, the Glinskys, had caused it through witchcraft. A mob stormed the Kremlin. For a moment, the Tsar of all Russia was again a terrified child surrounded by enemies. But this time, Ivan survived, and he adapted. He dismissed corrupt advisors. He gathered a new circle of young men loyal to him alone, later known as the Chosen Council. Together, they began reforming Russia. Laws were codified. Local administration was reorganized. The army was modernized. Ivan, in these early years, looked like the ruler Russia had waited for: brilliant, devout, disciplined. He married Anastasia Romanovna, a woman who calmed him, softened him, anchored him. With her at his side, Ivan could almost pass for humane. Almost. But the fire inside him never went out. It waited. Ivan expanded Russia aggressively. He conquered the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, breaking the power of the Tatars and opening the Volga. He ordered mass executions when cities resisted. He deported populations. He baptized survivors at sword point. He wrote letters describing himself as God's scourge. Victory fed his paranoia. Power sharpened his fear. Every success convinced him that enemies were everywhere, plotting to take it all away again. Then in 1560, Anastasia died. Ivan was 30. The woman who had restrained him was gone. He was convinced she had been poisoned by the boyars. There is evidence of mercury in her remains. Whether intentional or medicinal, Ivan did not care. The wound reopened. The child inside him screamed again. From that moment, Ivan's reign changed character. Where there had been reform, there was now suspicion. Where there had been punishment, there was now theater. Ivan began to see betrayal not as a possibility, but as a certainty. Russia was about to learn what fear looked like when it wore a crown. Ivan left Moscow abruptly in 1564, taking the treasury with him. He sent letters accusing the boyars and clergy of treason, then announced his abdication. Panic followed. Without Ivan, there was no state. The boyars begged him to return. He agreed, on conditions. In 1565, Ivan created the Oprichnina. This was not an institution. It was a weapon. The Oprichnina divided Russia in two. One part remained under traditional administration. The other belonged solely to Ivan, its territory, its army, its law. The men who served it wore black, rode black horses, and carried severed dog heads and brooms as symbols, to sniff out treason and sweep it away. They were the Oprichniki, and they answered only to Ivan. What followed was not governance, it was terror as policy. Nobles were accused without evidence. Estates were confiscated. Families were destroyed. Executions became rituals. Ivan attended them. Sometimes he led them. He wrote sermons about mercy and ordered massacres the same day. The worst came in 1570, in the city of Novgorod. Ivan believed Novgorod was conspiring with Lithuania. There was no proof. There did not need to be. He marched his Oprichniki into the city and unleashed hell. For weeks, the population was tortured, drowned, burned, impaled. Priests were slaughtered. Children were flung into the river. The city was broken as an example, even watched. This was not madness in the modern sense. It was deliberate. Fear was no longer a byproduct of power. It was the foundation of the state. But terror has a cost. The Oprichnina devastated the economy. Entire regions were emptied. The nobility was crippled, the army weakened. When the Crimean Tatars burned Moscow in 1571, Ivan's black-clad enforcers were useless. Still, Ivan did not stop. He could not. The monster he had built was the only thing holding him together. In 1581, in a fit of rage, Ivan struck his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich. The blow killed him. The Tsar of all Russia collapsed beside the body, screaming, weeping, trying to pull life back into a corpse he had created. This was the final truth of Ivan the Terrible. The fear that made him powerful also destroyed everything he touched. When Ivan died in 1584, Russia was larger, centralized, and scarred. The boyars were broken, the state endured, but the price was a legacy of brutality that would echo for centuries. The crowned child had become the monster, and in doing so, said he had forged a nation through terror. By the time Ivan IV had solidified the Oprichnina, Russia was no longer just a land of princes and peasants. It was a kingdom split into two realities, one ruled by law, tradition, and ritual, the other by fear, cruelty, and spectacle. The Oprichniki were the instruments of that terror, a cadre of men whose loyalty was absolute, whose violence was unchecked, and whose very existence blurred the line between life and death. They wore black, rode black horses, and carried symbols that announced their purpose before a word was spoken. Dog heads, sometimes mounted on spears, sniffing for treachery. Brooms, representing the sweeping away of all that opposed the Tsar. The sight alone struck panic into peasants, merchants, and nobility alike. Wherever the Oprichniki rode, silence followed, punctuated only by the wails of those condemned. The Oprichnina was not a chaotic reign of random brutality. It was a calculated instrument of statecraft, a social experiment rooted in Ivan's childhood lessons. Vulnerability is weakness, power is security, and fear is loyalty. When a boyar family fell under suspicion, Ivan did not hesitate. Entire estates could be confiscated on a single accusation. Courtiers disappeared overnight. Soldiers loyal to other princes were executed not just for dissent, but for the possibility of dissent. And Ivan watched it all unfold, his presence ensuring that rumor became fact, and fact became terror. In 1565, Novgorod became the centerpiece of Ivan's calculated fury. The city was wealthy, strategically critical, and steeped in tradition that resisted Moscow's central authority. Even
Tsar, convinced of a conspiracy between Novgorod and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, descended upon it with his Oprichniki. Unlike earlier purges, Novgorod would not be punished quietly, even intended to make the city a lesson, a cautionary tale carved into flesh and stone.
the Oprichniki entered in force, burning the outskirts to drive the population inward, corralled like cattle into narrow streets and squares. House by house, The oprichniki searched for evidence, any trace of disloyalty. Those accused were executed immediately. Nobles impaled, priests skinned alive, merchants drowned in the Volkhov River. Children were thrown from towers or beaten to death in the streets. Records estimate that over 10,000 people were killed during this campaign. By the time Ivan left, Novgorod was hollowed out, its population terrorized, its wealth confiscated, and its independence utterly broken. The terror of the Oprichnina was not confined to cities. Countryside estates were swept clean, peasants whipped into submission, and agricultural production redirected to sustain Moscow and the Oprichnina's army. Ivan's policies created famine in some regions, starvation in others, yet he justified these measures through a vision of a unified, centralized state, one ruled not by the whims of princes but by the absolute will of the Tsar. Every act of cruelty, every massacre, every confiscation was, in Ivan's mind, necessary. Fear was a tool, and Russia would survive only if every man, woman and child understood that rebellion equaled death. Historians today debate the psychology behind Ivan's methods. Some point to the death of his mother, poisoned by rivals, as the root of his paranoia. Others emphasize Anastasia's death, a moment that transformed cautious authority into indiscriminate rage. But it was more than personal trauma. Ivan understood a fundamental truth of power. Terror binds people more effectively than loyalty. When the boyars feared him, they obeyed. When the population feared him, they tolerated. The oprichniki were both the hammer and the shadow, a permanent reminder that the Tsar's eye never rested. Every action of the Oprichnina reinforced Ivan's dual identity, ruler and monster. His court became a theater of horror. Executions were staged to demonstrate his mercy or his wrath, depending on the lesson he wanted to impart. One noble could be publicly humiliated before being executed in a grotesque tableau. Another could be spared, allowed to live in a constant state of dread that any misstep could trigger death. Ivan would walk among the bodies, sometimes personally striking the guilty or the unlucky, sometimes whispering words of grace before the final blow. The psychological impact was immense. People began to govern themselves in fear of Ivan rather than through loyalty to the state. Russia was, for the first time, truly centralized, not by diplomacy nor by tradition, but by terror. The machinery of the Oprichnina also extended to intelligence and surveillance. Even cultivated spies, informants, and opportunists who could alert him to potential disloyalty at any hour. No noble could trust his neighbor. No servant could trust his master. The uncertainty was deliberate. Ivan believed that a nation constantly aware of its own vulnerability was stronger than one complacent in security. Rumors of plots were enough to trigger action, sometimes on the slightest suspicion. Executions were not just punishment, they were education. Every death was a lesson etched into the memory of the living. Even the church was not immune. Clergy who questioned Ivan's authority or resisted Oprichnina policies faced imprisonment, torture, or death. Monasteries were seized, wealth confiscated, and abbots humiliated in public ceremonies. Ivan justified this through divine right, claiming that his rule was ordained by God, and any resistance was heresy. Religion became another instrument of terror, reinforcing the omnipotence of the Tsar. Through these measures, Ivan transformed Russia into a state where law, loyalty, and even faith were inseparable from fear. Yet Ivan's terror was not unrestrained chaos. It was methodical, precise, and often symbolic. Public executions, mass punishments, and rituals of humiliation were choreographed to reinforce his narrative of absolute authority. By tying terror to spectacle, Ivan ensured that it resonated far beyond the victims themselves. People saw the consequences, understood the implications, and internalized the lesson. To oppose Ivan was to invite annihilation. In this way, fear became a form of governance, as effective, if not more so, than law or diplomacy. The Oprichnina also shaped Ivan's personal identity. He became both the father of the nation and the monster in the palace, a ruler whose cruelty was inseparable from his power. His diary entries, letters, and decrees reveal a man consumed by suspicion, yet relentless in his pursuit of centralized authority. He alternated between piety and rage, mercy and slaughter, genius and madness. To contemporaries, he was unpredictable and terrifying. To modern historians, he represents the dark potential of absolute power. By the 1570s, Ivan's reign of terror had reshaped the political landscape. Nobles were stripped of autonomy. Regional powers were weakened. Cities and provinces lived in fear. The state had been forged through blood, and loyalty was measured not in service but in survival. Russia was now a kingdom unified not through consensus but through terror, a terrifying proof of Ivan's philosophy. Fear was stronger than love, and control was worth any cost. Yet terror breeds instability. Despite his dominance, Ivan could never fully trust those around him, and paranoia continued to drive brutal acts of violence. In 1581, his rage culminated in the murder of his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, a moment that revealed both the Tsar's humanity and his monstrous capacity. Russia itself trembled at the loss, understanding that even the Tsar's own blood was expendable in the pursuit of power. Through the Oprichnina, Ivan had created a machine of fear that extended beyond immediate punishment. His methods became cultural memory, shaping behavior, governance, and social structures. Nobles learned submission, peasants learned caution, even enemies recognized the futility of resistance. Every act of violence, every ritualized execution, every confiscation served to cement Ivan's legacy, a ruler who could bend a nation to his will through terror alone. By the end of Part 2, the reader must understand that Ivan's Russia was not merely brutal, it was engineered. Every massacre, every punishment, every ritual was a thread in a tapestry of terror designed to consolidate power and prevent rebellion. The Oprichniki were not rogue agents, they were the architecture of control. The state had become a living instrument of fear, and Ivan the Terrible was the maestro, orchestrating destruction with precision and intent. By the late 1560s, Ivan IV, now entrenched as the absolute ruler of a terrorized and fractured Russia, had turned his gaze outward. The Oprichnina had solidified his internal power, but the boundaries of his dominion stretched only so far. Beyond Moscow lay the lands of the Kazan Khanate, a remnant of the Tatar-Mongol Golden Horde, whose nomadic warriors had long menaced Russian principalities. These were lands of rivers, dense forests, and fortified cities that had resisted conquest for centuries. Ivan's ambition, however, was insatiable. He understood that internal terror alone could only secure obedience. True power required expansion, the imposition of will across territories beyond the reach of fear alone. The conquest of Kazan, and later Astrakhan, would be his first test, not of cruelty, but of strategic genius, resource mobilization, and relentless ambition. In 1552, Ivan launched a campaign against Kazan. At first glance, this might appear as a typical medieval siege, but the operation was meticulously planned, an extension of the same precision that guided the Oprichnina. Russian forces, armed with newly constructed artillery, approached the Tatar city with a psychological as well as a physical plan of attack. Kazan's defenders, confident in centuries of resisting Russian princes, were shocked by the intensity and scale of Ivan's forces. Siege towers, cannons, and muskets, tools largely new to the region, brought the walls to rubble within weeks. But Ivan's genius lay not just in military hardware, it lay in terror as a weapon beyond Moscow. He forced civilians to witness the deaths of their leaders. Merchants, artisans, and soldiers were executed in sight of the city gates, and stories of mass slaughter spread throughout the steppe, eroding morale before the walls were breached. By the end of October 1552, Kazan fell, the city was sacked, its Khan executed, and Ivan installed a Russian garrison to secure the conquest. The victory was not simply territorial, it sent a clear message. Russia was no longer a fragmented collection of principalities. It was an empire capable of extending its reach and punishing dissent on a vast scale. Yet the conquest of Kazan was only the beginning. Ivan understood that power was fragile, and the newly subjugated regions required more than military occupation. They required integration, a transformation of social and political structures. Kazan's Muslim elite were forced to swear fealty. Orthodox churches were established where mosques had once stood, and Russian settlers moved into newly conquered lands to solidify control. But Ivan's approach was brutal. Rebellions were crushed immediately and publicly. Entire villages were destroyed if resistance persisted, their survivors executed or enslaved. By blending military conquest with systematic terror, Ivan created a precedent. Resistance was not merely futile, it was a death sentence. Every town, every settlement, every fortress learned to obey, for fear had become as effective as swords. The psychological calculus of Ivan's campaigns extended to the Russian heartland as well. While the Oprichnina had terrorized the boyars, the expansionist wars demanded loyalty from the military aristocracy and the emerging bureaucratic class. Nobles were required to provide troops, maintain supply lines, and enforce conscription or face reprisals from Ivan's agents. Failure to comply, even inadvertently, could result in the confiscation of estates, exile, or execution. The Tsar's system linked personal survival to obedience, turning the nobility into both administrators and enforcers of Ivan's will. This dual role reinforced Ivan's absolute authority. The state was his, the people were his, and the consequences of defiance were immediate and deadly. But expansion was not limited to foreign conquests. Ivan's centralization of power extended into the very mechanisms of governance. He restructured the Duma, the Council of Boyars, filling it with men loyal not by heritage but by fear, men whose fortunes depended on unwavering obedience. Regional governors, previously semi-autonomous princes, were replaced with voyevodas, administrators chosen for loyalty and ruthlessness. Ivan implemented a system of taxation and conscription that bound every peasant and soldier to the state, ensuring that no pocket of resistance could flourish. The bureaucracy, once loose and fragmented, became a mechanism of surveillance and enforcement. Letters, reports, and messengers conveyed not only logistical needs, but evidence of disloyalty, enabling Ivan to strike preemptively against potential threats. In this way, the architecture of terror became inseparable from governance, and fear became the lubricant of the state machine. Yet Ivan's rule was not without its contradictions. While he enforced absolute control, he also cultivated religious and cultural legitimacy to reinforce his authority. The Russian Orthodox Church became both a tool and a shield. Ivan positioned himself as God's chosen ruler, the protector of orthodoxy against the encroaching powers of the Tatars and Catholic Europe. Public ceremonies, such as the coronation of Tsars in the Cathedral of the Dormition, became spectacles of divine sanction, reinforcing the notion that his power was both earthly and sacred. Clergy who resisted the oprichnina or his expansionist policies were punished, but loyal clerics were rewarded with lands, privileges, and influence, creating a symbiosis of terror and faith that made dissent not only dangerous, but morally suspect. The consolidation of absolute power also extended into the realm of succession and dynastic security. Ivan's paranoia, fueled by years of perceived betrayal and loss, drove him to regulate marriage, birth, and inheritance with extreme precision. His children, potential heirs to the throne, were not merely heirs, they were pawns, symbols, and instruments of control. Yet tragedy struck repeatedly. His first wife, Anastasia, whose death had already ignited deep psychological scars, was followed by a series of politically motivated marriages that produced heirs but also fueled uncertainty and instability within the royal family. The Tsar's relationship with his son, Ivan Ivanovich, who would eventually be killed by the Tsar's own hand, demonstrates the deadly intersection of fear, power, and familial control. Ivan's personal terror mirrored his governance, absolute, unflinching, and uncompromising. Throughout this period, Ivan's Russia became both more cohesive and more brittle. Regions once loosely connected by loyalty to the Grand Prince of Moscow were now bound by fear, terror, and the omnipresence of the oprichnina. Military campaigns extended the state's reach, but each conquest required vigilance, surveillance, and preemptive violence to prevent rebellion. Nobles governed through obedience to Ivan rather than law. Peasants worked under the constant threat of confiscation, flogging, or execution. The Tsar had created a nation that functioned efficiently in its terror, but the human cost was immense. Families were destroyed, cities depopulated, and generations lived in the shadow of a ruler whose reach was absolute. Ivan's reign also reshaped Russia's international position. The fall of Kazan and later Astrakhan expanded the empire to the Volga River and beyond, opening trade routes and securing strategic territories. Foreign powers, observing the unrelenting precision and brutality of Ivan's campaigns, approached diplomacy cautiously. Ambassadors from Western Europe reported tales of the oprichniki and the Tsar's unpredictability, while Tatar and Ottoman leaders recognized the growing threat of a centralized, militarized Russia under Ivan's command. In this way, Ivan's domestic policies of fear translated into international influence. His reputation became both a weapon and a deterrent, ensuring that Russia would be treated with caution long before it could project military power across Europe. Yet the human element of Ivan's terror remained central. His campaigns were not abstract exercises in statecraft. They were personal expressions of his psychology. Ivan's childhood trauma, his constant suspicion of betrayal, and his obsession with divine sanction all fused into a governance model that equated survival with loyalty, obedience with life, and dissent with death. Historians today debate whether Ivan's cruelty was entirely rational, entirely paranoid, or a combination of both. What is undeniable, however, is that his actions left a permanent imprint on the Russian state, its culture, and its collective memory. Fear, once personal, had become institutionalized. By the mid-1580s, Ivan had transformed Russia into an empire in both territory and spirit. Cities, towns, and fortresses extended from Moscow to Kazan, from the Volga to the northern forests. Nobles had been subdued, bureaucrats installed, and peasants brought into line through a combination of terror and coercion. The oprichnina had formalized the use of fear as a governing principle, and Ivan himself had become both the architect and embodiment of that terror. Russia was no longer merely a collection of principalities. It was a centralized state, unified under the gaze of a ruler who wielded fear as precisely as a sword. Yet Ivan's absolute power came at a cost. The human toll of conquest, purges, and surveillance was staggering. Thousands of nobles, clergy, and peasants died under his command. Cities like Novgorod and Kazan bore scars that would last for generations. Family bonds were shattered, and political alliances were rendered meaningless in the face of his suspicion. The psychological impact on the population was profound. People learned not to trust, not to speak freely, and not to act without authorization. Obedience became instinctive, survival a constant negotiation with terror. Ivan's reign had created a state that was strong in authority, but fragile in trust, dependent entirely on the omnipresence of fear. By consolidating power, expanding territory, and instilling fear as the cornerstone of governance, Ivan IV had created a Russia fundamentally different from any European state of the time. Centralization was no longer theoretical, it was enforced through terror. Loyalty was not a choice, it was a requirement. Obedience was survival, and survival was guaranteed only through submission to the will of the Tsar. Ivan had not merely conquered lands, he had conquered the human spirit, embedding a culture of fear into the DNA of the state. As the 1580s progressed, Ivan's Russia was poised for both greatness and catastrophe. The machinery of terror and expansion was functioning with terrifying efficiency, yet cracks were beginning to appear. The Oprichnina, while effective in Moscow and core territories, could not be everywhere at once. The distant regions required governors and local administrators whose loyalty was never absolute. Even as Ivan extended the empire's borders, he could not eliminate the risk of rebellion, disease, famine, or military defeat. The balance between fear and control, between tyranny and governance, remained delicate. By the time of his later years, Ivan had become an icon of both awe and horror. Foreign diplomats spoke of him in whispered tones. Russian chroniclers wrote of his deeds with a mixture of reverence and dread. His personal life was marred by tragedy, his family by murder and misfortune. Yet through it all, Ivan remained absolute, the master of his domain, the architect of terror, and the Tsar who had transformed Russia through fear. Every conquest, every execution, every decree had been a brick in the edifice of his power. Russia was centralized, its borders expanded, its people subdued. But Ivan knew the fragility of power, and his later years were consumed with paranoia, planning, and the consolidation of his legacy. Ivan IV's story is not merely one of cruelty, it is the story of a ruler who understood the mechanics of power in their most brutal form. Through terror, through the Oprichnina, through conquest and centralized governance, he created a state that could endure long after his death. Yet the cost was immeasurable. The destruction of lives, the trauma inflicted on generations, and the embedding of fear into the culture and governance of Russia itself. Ivan's reign exemplifies the paradox of absolute power. It is at once durable and destructive, a force that can create empires while simultaneously eroding the humanity of both ruler and ruled. By the early 1580s, Ivan IV, now in the final decade of his life, was both revered and reviled. He was no longer the energetic young Tsar who had seized Kazan or reshaped Novgorod. Age, disease, and years of constant paranoia had hollowed him. His once sharp mind, capable of meticulously orchestrating military campaigns and political purges, now wavered under the weight of obsession. Yet the empire he had built, grounded in fear and obedience, stood as a testament to the terrifying effectiveness of his methods. The Oprichnina had faded officially in 1572, but the lessons it had instilled remained. No noble could act without the gaze of the Tsar upon them. No peasant could step outside the boundaries of his decrees, and the machinery of surveillance, punishment, and terror was embedded into every level of governance. Ivan's Russia had become a living, breathing apparatus of fear, a state whose people were both bound to and imprisoned by the will of one man. In these final years, Ivan's attention shifted repeatedly between external threats and internal anxieties. While foreign powers, Poland, Sweden, and the remnants of the Crimean Khanate, posed intermittent challenges, Ivan's greater concern was domestic. He obsessed over loyalty, lineage, and succession. The early deaths of many of his heirs had left him increasingly unstable. His son, Ivan Ivanovich, the heir apparent, had been killed in 1581 during a violent confrontation with his father, a blow that would haunt Ivan until his death. Witnesses reported that Ivan's grief was twisted, mixing sorrow, guilt, and rage into a lethal cocktail of despair and tyranny. This act of parricide, whether intentional or accidental, underscores the depth of Ivan's psychological deterioration. Even as a man who had orchestrated the deaths of thousands, Ivan was trapped by his own fear, mistrust, and emotional volatility. His rage, once a tool of statecraft, had become a self-perpetuating cycle that consumed the people closest to him. The death of Ivan Ivanovich left the succession in peril. Even the fourth had surviving sons, but their numbers were few and their health fragile. Fyodor Ivanovich, sickly and introverted, became the nominal heir. Ivan knew that the survival of his dynasty depended on controlling not only the state apparatus, but also the minds and loyalties of those around his successor. He began to manipulate the court and the church to ensure that Fyodor would inherit not just the throne, but also an obedient machinery of terror, one that could carry forward the policies Ivan had perfected over decades. Yet this succession was fraught with uncertainty. Fyodor lacked his father's force of will, his ruthlessness, and his capacity for instilling fear. Ivan's Russia, centralized and efficient, now depended on a ruler who was ill-equipped to wield the very tools that had defined the empire's formation. Despite these domestic worries, Ivan continued to pursue military campaigns. His later years saw efforts to consolidate control in the east and along the volatile southern frontiers. The conquest of Astrakhan in 1556 had secured access to the Caspian Sea, opening trade routes with Persia and Central Asia, but the region remained unstable. Tribal revolts, border skirmishes, and the constant threat of foreign intervention kept Ivan engaged in near-constant planning and supervision. Each campaign, whether in the steppe or along the Volga, was conducted with a precision born of decades of experience. Yet even as he extended the state's influence, Ivan's methods were unchanged. Terror remained the primary tool of control. Villages suspected of rebellion were destroyed, rebellious nobles executed, and captives paraded as warnings. Every act, every battle, every punishment reinforced the perception that Ivan's will was absolute, his vengeance infinite, and his cruelty personal. By the late 1580s, the physical and psychological toll of Ivan's reign was unmistakable. Chroniclers describe him as increasingly withdrawn, living in near-constant fear of assassination. Even his closest advisors and servants operated under suspicion, knowing that a misstep could cost them their lives. The Tsar's mood swings became legendary. Moments of extreme melancholy alternated with episodes of explosive rage. He would feast lavishly one day, ordering banquets and entertainment, only to execute courtiers the next, often on the flimsiest of pretexts. This volatility reinforced the culture of fear he had instilled for decades. Nobles and bureaucrats learned that survival required absolute obedience, the suppression of independent thought, and a constant readiness to demonstrate loyalty. In this environment, personal ambition was subordinate to the whims of the Tsar, and the state itself became inseparable from Ivan's persona. Yet Ivan's reign also left behind structural legacies that would shape Russia for centuries. The centralization of authority, the subjugation of the nobility, and the integration of conquered territories created a model of governance that endured well beyond his death. The Russian Orthodox Church, manipulated to reinforce Ivan's divine authority, became a stabilizing force even as his successors struggled to maintain the same level of control. The military reforms initiated during his reign, including the development of standing armies and fortified garrisons in key regions, provided the infrastructure for further expansion. In every sense, Ivan had created a state that could survive his absence, but one built on fear, coercion, and the unpredictable exercise of absolute power. The final years of Ivan's life were marked by a relentless obsession with mortality and the continuity of his legacy. He inspected the construction of fortresses, reviewed military campaigns, and monitored his officials with increasing intensity. His correspondence, often detailed to the point of obsession, reveals a man consumed by the desire to control both the present and the future. Even as age weakened his body, his mind remained engaged in the orchestration of terror as governance. Execution lists, surveillance reports, and accounts of rebellion were his daily focus. To Ivan, the state was a living extension of his will, and any perceived weakness was a threat to the stability of the empire he had forged. In 1584, Ivan IV died, reportedly from a stroke, though accounts vary. His death marked the end of a reign unparalleled in its combination of terror, military conquest, and centralization of authority. Russia had been transformed from a collection of fractious principalities into a centralized, territorially expansive, and fear-bound empire. The immediate aftermath of Ivan's death was a mixture of relief, uncertainty, and mourning. His surviving son, Fyodor, assumed the throne, inheriting not only the title of Tsar but also the complex machinery of governance, the network of loyal administrators, and the culture of fear that had become intrinsic to the Russian state. The legacy of Ivan the Terrible is impossible to overstate. He is remembered as a man who combined extraordinary intelligence and vision with extreme cruelty and paranoia. He created an empire through fear, violence, and meticulous centralization, leaving behind a political and cultural blueprint that would influence Russian governance for centuries. Cities and fortresses bore the marks of his campaigns, the Orthodox Church retained the imprint of his religious manipulations, and the nobility remained subdued, conditioned by generations of terror. Ivan IV's reign was both a personal tragedy and a national triumph, the triumph of a man who transformed a fragmented land into a unified empire, and the tragedy of the human suffering required to achieve it. Even centuries later, historians and psychologists debate the nature of Ivan's cruelty. Was it calculated statecraft, personal madness, or a combination of both? What is certain is that he understood fear as a tool of unparalleled power. Where diplomacy, law, or persuasion might fail, terror succeeded. The executions, the purges, the psychological manipulation, and the display of brutality were not merely acts of vengeance, they were instruments of governance. By controlling the minds of his subjects as ruthlessly as he commanded the armies and fortresses of his realm, Ivan IV created a state capable of enduring even the collapse of his immediate family line. The terrifying genius of Ivan IV lay in his understanding that empires are not maintained merely through conquest, they are maintained through obedience, through the perception of omnipotence, and through the pervasive, almost spiritual fear that one man can inflict upon millions. He leveraged childhood trauma, paranoia, religious authority, and military power into a seamless model of autocracy. This model would echo throughout Russian history, influencing rulers from Peter the Great to Joseph Stalin, each aware that the machinery of terror could mold both a state and the psyche of its people. By the end of his life, Ivan had achieved what few rulers could. He had unified a sprawling and diverse territory under his direct authority, imposed a system of governance dependent on obedience and fear, and created a dynasty whose legacy would shape not just Russia, but the perception of Russian power for centuries. The horror, the brilliance, the terror, and the strategic genius were inseparable in Ivan IV. He was a man who ruled through fear, yet whose fear extended beyond himself, shaping a nation, its institutions, and its people in his image. Ivan the Terrible was not merely a tyrant, he was the architect of a Russian state forged in terror, an empire born of suffering, and a legacy that endured long after his death. His story is a cautionary tale and a historical cornerstone, the making of a state through fear, the cost of absolute power, and the enduring mark of a ruler who understood that terror, when wielded precisely, can be more powerful than armies or alliances. Russia survived Ivan IV, but it carried the weight of his reign for centuries, a living reminder that fear, once institutionalized, can become the foundation of empire. Ivan's shadow extended beyond his tomb, shaping the governance, culture, and psyche of a nation for generations to come.